Have you ever looked into a crowd on the happiest day of your life and found the only faces that truly mattered missing? I still remember the silence. Not the music, not the guests, not even the sound of my own heartbeat. What I remember most were two empty chairs in the front row. Each one had a small white card resting against the back, reserved for parents. No one was sitting there. My parents weren't late, they weren't stuck in traffic, they weren't in the hospital. They had simply decided to be somewhere else. At almost that exact moment, while I was standing outside the chapel waiting for the doors to open, my family's official Instagram account uploaded a new post, celebrating the future of the Whitmore legacy. It wasn't about their younger daughter's wedding. It was a polished photo of my older sister, Claire, smiling beside a large architectural rendering of Whitmore Estate's luxury expansion project. Hundreds of comments poured in within minutes. The perfect family. Congratulations on the next chapter. What an incredible legacy. No one knew that less than 5 miles away, one daughter was about to walk down the aisle completely without her parents. People often ask me what hurt the most. It wasn't that they missed my wedding. It was knowing they had made a choice, and they hadn't chosen me. My name is Hannah Widmore. I'm 31 years old, and until recently, I believed that if I worked hard enough, stayed kind enough, and waited patiently enough, eventually my parents would see me the way they saw my sister. I was wrong. I work as a conservator at the National Maritime Archive, where I restore old ship logs, handwritten journals, personal letters, and historical documents that have been damaged by time. Most people have never even heard of my profession. It doesn't pay particularly well, and it certainly doesn't make headlines. But I love it. There's something almost sacred about rescuing voices that history nearly erased. Every forgotten voice deserves to be heard. The man waiting for me at the altar was Ethan Brooks, my fiancé, soon to become my husband. Ethan is a structural engineer. He spends his days making sure bridges, buildings, and public spaces can withstand pressure without collapsing. Sometimes I think that's why I fell in love with him. He understood that strength isn't loud. It's quiet, reliable, patient. Unlike me, Ethan never tried to fight my parents. He never argued with them. He never demanded their approval. Whenever they dismissed me, he would simply squeeze my hand and whisper, "You don't have to earn love from people who keep moving the finish line." Back then, I wanted to believe he was wrong. The Whitmore family wasn't just another wealthy family in Connecticut. For nearly 27 years, my parents had built Whitmore Estate into one of the state's most sought-after wedding venues. Elegant gardens, restored colonial architecture, lakeside ceremonies, charity galas. Our family business had become a symbol of prestige. Magazines called us Connecticut's first family of weddings. Local television stations loved interviewing my parents. Every article described us the same way, a family business built on love. Looking back now, those words almost make me laugh. Not because they were completely false, but because they were only true for one daughter. My older sister, Claire Whitmore, had been raised to inherit everything. Claire wasn't a bad person. She was charismatic, talented, and one of the most recognizable wedding designers in New England. Since she was young, my parents invested in her education, introduced her to influential clients, and proudly presented her as the future of Whitmore Estate. Whenever visitors reported, Claire stood beside our parents. Whenever advertisements were printed, Claire appeared on the cover. Whenever investors came to tour the property, Claire led the presentations. She was the future. I was barely part of the picture. Growing up, I told myself that our parents simply recognized different talents. Claire belonged in business, I belonged in history. That explanation comforted me for years, until I realized something much harder to accept. My career preserved forgotten stories. Claire's career generated revenue. One made them proud. Even on birthdays and holidays, conversations somehow circled back to Claire's latest project, Claire's latest client, Claire's newest magazine feature. If anyone asked about me, my mother usually smiled and said, "Hannah works with old documents." Then the conversation would move on. It never sounded cruel. That's what made it hurt even more. Being ignored can leave deeper scars than being insulted. The coordinator gently touched my arm. "It's time." The chapel doors slowly opened. Sunlight spilled across the aisle. Every guest stood. I took one instinctive glance toward the front row. Those two chairs were still empty. For a brief second, I imagined hearing the doors behind me open. I imagined my parents rushing in, apologizing, saying they'd made a terrible mistake. The doors never opened, so I lifted my chin, I smiled at Ethan, and I walked forward anyway. At that moment, I believed my parents had chosen my sister over me. I had no idea they had already chosen money over all of us. When Ethan and I came home from our honeymoon, I honestly believed the hardest part of my life was already behind me. I thought the empty chairs at my wedding would eventually become just another painful family memory. I had no idea they were only the beginning. 3 days after we returned, I received a voicemail from someone I didn't recognize. The message was calm and professional. "Ms. Whitmore, my name is Richard Lawson. I served as your grandmother Margaret Whitmore's estate attorney. I've been trying to reach you regarding your family trust. Please call me at your earliest convenience." At first, I assumed it was a mistake. My grandmother had passed away almost 12 years earlier. Why would her attorney suddenly contact me now? That afternoon, I called him back. Richard Lawson sounded older than I expected, but incredibly organized. He had represented my grandmother for years and had helped establish her estate plan before she died. After confirming my identity, he asked me a question that completely caught me off guard. "Hannah, when did you officially assume control of your trust?" I laughed awkwardly. "I'm sorry, my what?" There was a long silence. Then he asked another question. "You do know your grandmother created a separate family trust for you." I didn't answer immediately because I had never heard those words before. Richard sounded genuinely confused. "I was under the impression your trustee transferred management to you 6 years ago." 6 years. That number echoed in my head. I was 31 now. If his timeline was correct, something should have happened when I turned 25. Nothing had. Richard invited Ethan and me to his office the following morning. As we sat across from his conference table, he placed 2 thick folders from in front of us. One had my sister Claire's name, the other had mine. Richard explained everything carefully. My grandmother hadn't simply left money behind. She had established 2 independent family trusts, one for Claire and one for me. They weren't ordinary bank accounts. My grandmother believed each granddaughter deserved financial independence. The rule was simple. When each of us reached the age of 25, management of the trust was legally supposed to be transferred directly to us. Richard looked directly at me. According to my records, that transfer should have happened 6 years ago. I quietly answered, "It never did." He frowned. "Are you certain?" I nodded. "No one has ever mentioned a trust to me. I've never signed transfer documents. I've never received financial statements. Nothing." For the first time during the meeting, Richard stopped taking notes. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the files. "I don't understand." Neither did I. Over the next hour, he reviewed every document he had kept since my grandmother's death. The trust itself clearly existed. Walter Whitmore, my father, had been appointed as the initial trustee because Claire and I were still young adults when our grandmother died. But that authority wasn't supposed to last forever. It was temporary. Richard carefully closed the folder. Then he looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. "Hannah," he hesitated for a moment before finishing the sentence. "I think this is much bigger than a delayed transfer." Richard Lawson, my grandmother's former estate attorney, had been right. This wasn't just a delayed transfer. It was something far more complicated. Over the next several weeks, my life became a cycle of conference rooms, legal documents, and conversations I never imagined having. Melissa Grant, my probate attorney, handled the legal side of the investigation. Daniel Ortiz, the forensic accountant she had brought onto the case, focused on tracing every dollar that had ever moved through my trust. Daniel had a phrase he repeated almost every time we met: "People lie, numbers don't." At first, the financial records didn't reveal anything dramatic. There wasn't one giant withdrawal that immediately screamed fraud. Instead, Daniel found something much stranger. The money had disappeared slowly, patiently, almost invisibly, over 4 years. He spread several printed spreadsheets across the conference table. There wasn't one transfer, he said. There were 11. 11 transfers, each one relatively modest, each small enough to avoid attention. Daniel tapped one highlighted column. Whoever authorized these transactions understood exactly how to avoid attracting attention. My stomach tightened. "You think that was intentional?" He answered calmly, "I deal in evidence, Hannah, not opinions." Then he slid another document toward me. Every payment had gone to only 3 destinations: Whitmore Hospitality, Claire Design Studio, or the Whitmore Development Initiative Fund. I recognized every name immediately. Whitmore Hospitality was my family's primary business. Claire Design Studio belonged to my older sister. The development fund had been created years earlier to finance renovations and expansion projects at Whitmore Estate. For several seconds, no one in the room spoke. I wanted to believe there had to be another explanation, but Melissa quietly shook her head before I could even ask. "If trust assets are invested this way, there should be extensive documentation authorizing it." Daniel nodded. "So far, we haven't found any." One question kept repeating inside my head. How had nobody noticed? Daniel answered before I asked. Because Walter Whitmore remained the acting trustee, my father. As long as he legally controlled the trust, he had authority to manage its accounts. The system assumed trustees would fulfill their responsibilities honestly. If someone abused that position carefully enough, the abuse could remain hidden for years. Daniel wasn't finished. He opened another folder. This one wasn't about my trust, it was about Whitmore Estate. I expected to see a thriving company. After all, that's exactly what everyone believed. Local magazines celebrated our success, and my parents appeared at charity galas. Everything looked successful from the outside. The financial records told an entirely different story. Daniel pointed to several balance sheets. Whitmore Hospitality is carrying more than $5 million in debt. The business is surviving primarily through borrowed money. Lines of credit, commercial loans, refinancing. The documents painted a picture that looked nothing like the polished image my family had spent decades creating. Suddenly, dozens of memories started making sense. My parents hadn't been expanding from strength, they had been trying to outrun financial collapse. Melissa looked directly at me. "Hannah, I think you need to understand something. This investigation isn't only about missing trust assets anymore." Daniel reached for a presentation folder labeled Whitmore Estate Expansion Campaign. Inside were marketing proposals and architectural renderings. Then I saw the date. The campaign was scheduled to launch the same weekend as Claire's wedding. Daniel explained what we were looking at. The event wasn't just a family celebration, it was part of a marketing strategy. The ceremony itself had become a showcase for luxury vendors and potential investors. Everything had been carefully orchestrated.
If the event succeeded, investors were expected to finance the next phase of Whitmore Estates' expansion. For years, I believed my parents skipped my wedding because they simply loved Claire more than they loved me. That wasn't the whole truth. They hadn't chosen Claire because she was their favorite. They had chosen the event they believed could save the business. My wedding had been compared to a business opportunity, and I had become an expense they could afford to lose. They chose money and desperation over me. But desperation doesn't erase responsibility, and it certainly doesn't excuse betrayal. Daniel quietly gathered the files before speaking one final time. I think we've finally figured out why they kept control of your trust. What we still don't know, he said, is how far they were willing to go to keep the entire system from collapsing. That question stayed with me long after I left his office, because deep down, I was beginning to fear the answer.
By the time Daniel Ortiz, the forensic accountant working with my legal team, finished tracing the money, one question refused to leave my mind. How much did Claire actually know? It would have been easy to make my older sister the villain. After everything I had learned, I wanted someone to blame besides my parents. Claire seemed like the obvious choice. After all, some of my trust money had ended up in her design company. She had benefited from it, while I spent years believing I simply hadn't inherited anything. But the deeper our investigation went, the more complicated the truth became. And complicated truths are usually the hardest ones to live with. Melissa Grant, my probate attorney, arranged for us to review years of internal emails, financial records, and business correspondence that had become available through the discovery process. We weren't looking for dramatic confessions, we were looking for patterns. One afternoon, Melissa slid several emails across the table. "They're between your father and Claire." I took a deep breath before reading them. Most of the messages weren't about my trust at all. They were about construction schedules, wedding bookings, marketing campaigns, and vendor contracts. Everything you would expect from a family business trying to stay afloat. Then one sentence caught my attention. It came from my father. "We'll use Hannah's funds temporarily until everything stabilizes." Another email, written months later, read, "Once the expansion succeeds, we'll pay her back with interest." I stared at the screen. There was no anger in those words, no admission of stealing, just certainty, as if my future had become another business asset. Melissa looked at me carefully. "Read Claire's replies." I did. "If you're sure that's allowed," she wrote. Another one said, "I trust your judgment." And another, "I don't want Hannah to be hurt by this." There was no response after that. Daniel finally broke the silence. "These emails don't suggest Claire planned the transfers." Melissa nodded. "They suggest your father believed." That realization landed harder than I expected. Claire believed him. Why wouldn't she? He was our father, and the trustee legally responsible for managing the money. She had spent her entire life believing he knew what he was doing. It didn't make everything acceptable, but it made the situation painfully human. People don't always become part of wrongdoing because they're cruel. Sometimes they become part of it because they choose to trust the wrong person. Weeks later, another discovery complicated everything even more. Among thousands of financial documents, Daniel found a scanned report prepared several years earlier. Near the bottom of one page appeared a heading, "Beneficiary Trust, Hannah Whitmore." Claire's electronic signature appeared on the following page, acknowledging receipt of several business documents. She had seen my name. She had seen enough to ask questions, but she never did. When Melissa explained what that meant legally, she was careful with her words. Seeing something isn't the same as participating. Claire didn't control the trust. I understood. Claire hadn't ordered the transfers, but she had reached a moment where curiosity could have changed everything. Instead, she looked away. Sometimes silence isn't a crime, but choices have consequences. That realization hurt almost as much as learning what my father had done, because it reminded me how easily good people can convince themselves not to ask difficult questions.
A few days later, while Ethan and I were sorting through boxes I'd stored after my grandmother passed, I found something I had completely forgotten, an old wooden storage box. Inside were photographs, letters, recipe cards, and beneath everything else, a small collection of cassette tapes. I smiled immediately. My grandmother loved recording memories. She believed voices carried emotions that writing never could. Ethan found an old cassette player at an antique store, and that evening we sat together in our living room, listening to recordings that hadn't been played in over a decade. Most were ordinary: laughter, holiday dinners, grandchildren running through the house. Then one tape was labeled only with a date, no title, no explanation. When it played back, I immediately recognized my grandmother's voice. It sounded older than I remembered, gentler, more fragile. She wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. It felt more like she was leaving a message for whoever might one day need to hear it. "My girls," she paused. "If you're listening to this, I'm probably gone." I felt tears forming before I even realized it. She spoke about family, kindness, and responsibility. Then she said something I'll never forget. "If you ever have to choose between peace and truth, choose truth. Peace built on lies never lasts, and the people who truly love you will never ask you to sacrifice the truth just to keep them comfortable." I looked over at Ethan. Neither of us said a word because we both understood the same thing. This recording wasn't legal evidence. It couldn't recover a single dollar, but it reminded me why I couldn't just walk away. For weeks, I'd questioned whether exposing my own family was worth the pain it would cause, whether staying silent might somehow be the kinder choice. My grandmother had answered that question years before I ever needed it. Sometimes truth is the highest form of love. I carefully placed the cassette back into its case. For the first time since the investigation had begun, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not revenge, clarity. The case was never just about recovering an inheritance. It was about refusing to let a lie become my family's final legacy.
I never planned to ruin my sister's wedding. I didn't want public drama or revenge. I just didn't want another lie. But the truth is, by then, our family had already fallen apart. The wedding was simply the day everyone else finally saw it. Claire's ceremony was held at Whitmore Estate. From the outside, everything looked flawless. Luxury cars, fresh flowers, a string quartet. Exactly the image my parents had spent their entire lives selling. But this wasn't just another wedding. Melissa Grant, my probate attorney, had explained that the guest list included commercial lenders, investment partners, and bank executives. Some guests weren't there because they cared about Claire. They were there because Whitmore Estate had become a business opportunity. Claire's wedding was the company's biggest marketing event of the year, a showcase to secure millions for a luxury expansion. That expansion depended entirely on one thing: confidence. If that confidence disappeared, everything would collapse. A week before the ceremony, Melissa called Ethan and I into her office. "We're not going to interrupt the wedding," she told us. I felt an unexpected wave of relief. Then she added, "But we're also not going to hide evidence from people who are about to invest millions of dollars." Melissa's plan was simple. At a specific time during the reception, her office would electronically deliver our completed forensic audit directly to every investor in the room. No dramatic speeches, no surprise presentations, just verified facts delivered to the people who had a legal right to see them. No one could stop an email. When Ethan and I arrived at Whitmore Estate, it looked exactly the way I remembered from childhood: perfect, beautiful, carefully controlled. None of the guests knew that underneath the polished surface sat more than $5 million in debt and years of concealed financial decisions. Claire looked beautiful. As I watched her greeting guests, I realized she looked genuinely happy. She had no idea what was coming. For a brief moment, I almost wished we had never discovered any of it. Almost. Then I remembered the empty chairs at my own wedding. Some truths arrive late, but they still deserve to arrive.
As dinner concluded, my father, Walter Whitmore, stepped onto the stage. He had always been an excellent public speaker, confident, warm, convincing. He welcomed the crowd, thanked the investors, and then smiled toward Claire. "My daughter represents the future of everything we've built," he said. The audience applauded. Walter raised his glass and delivered the sentence I will never forget. "Family is the foundation of everything we've built." At almost that exact moment, phones around the ballroom began vibrating, one after another. Several investors glanced down. A bank executive opened his email, then another, then another. Within seconds, conversations quietly stopped. Melissa's email had arrived exactly as scheduled. Attached was the complete forensic audit, every illegal transfer, every hidden account. I watched confusion spread across the room. One of the lead investors slowly stood from his table, holding several printed pages his assistant had quickly grabbed. He looked toward my father, his voice calm and professional. "Mr. Whitmore, can someone explain why trust assets were used as operating capital?" The ballroom became completely silent. No music played, even the photographers lowered their cameras. For several long seconds, my father simply stared at him. Then Walter forced a smile. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding." The investor didn't sit down. "The accounting records appear very specific." Walter looked toward the bank representatives, then toward his legal advisor, searching the room for someone who could rescue him. No one spoke. Claire slowly walked toward him. She wasn't angry yet. She looked frightened. She glanced at the documents in the investor's hands, then back at our father. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Dad, please tell me this isn't true." For the first time in my entire life, my father had no answer. He didn't deny it. He didn't explain it. He simply stood there, silent. Claire looked at him for several heartbreaking seconds, and then she understood. She realized the life she believed she had been building was supported by lies. Slowly, she reached up, unclipped the microphone attached to her dress, and placed it gently on the table beside him. Without saying another word, Claire turned around and walked away. After Claire walked away from her own wedding reception, there was no pretending anymore. The carefully polished image of the Whitmore family had cracked in front of everyone. But public embarrassment wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of the legal one. A week later, my probate attorney, Melissa Grant, filed the lawsuit. We sued for trust litigation, fraud, forgery, and breach of fiduciary duty. Melissa reminded me that cases like this aren't won by emotional speeches, they're won by evidence. That brought us to the next phase, discovery. Before this, I had only ever heard that word on television courtroom dramas. Now it was my reality. Discovery meant no more carefully managed family stories and no more selective memories. Melissa immediately issued subpoenas to banks, accounting firms, and tech companies. Soon, boxes of documents began arriving at our office every single week. Thousands of pages of financial statements, corporate filings, tax records, and archived emails. It felt completely overwhelming. But our forensic accountant, Daniel Ortiz, kept us grounded. He told me that complicated financial fraud is never hidden in just one document. It's hidden across hundreds of them. Over the next few months, our legal team slowly assembled the puzzle. Witnesses were called to answer questions under oath. Former employees and accountants filled in the missing pieces, recalling unusual financial instructions from my father and last-minute rushes to move money. Then Daniel called Melissa with urgency in his voice. "I think we found something." The next morning, Ethan and I met them at the office. Daniel placed a loan application on the conference table. "It never closed," he said. I looked at the paperwork, confused. Under the heading Personal Guarantor, there was a familiar name, mine. The signature looked remarkably like my own, but I had never seen this document in my life. The application showed that I had supposedly agreed to personally guarantee a massive commercial loan to support the Whitmore estate expansion. If the business failed to repay that debt, I would have been legally responsible for millions in business debt. I never agreed to this, I whispered. Melissa nodded. We know. You didn't even know it existed. Daniel explained that a routine internal review by the bank's compliance department noticed irregularities in my signature. They requested additional verification. My father quietly abandoned the application, and the loan was never finalized. Melissa looked directly at me. If the bank hadn't caught it, you could have become personally responsible for millions in business debt. The room became completely silent. Forgery doesn't become legal just because it fails. My father had been willing to use my identity to save his business. He simply hadn't succeeded. A few weeks later, we got a phone call that surprised all of us. Claire wanted to meet. When she arrived at the office, the confident wedding designer everyone admired was gone. In her place sat a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in days. She didn't offer excuses, and she didn't defend our parents. She simply looked at me and said, "I should have asked more questions." Claire lowered her eyes, her voice breaking. I believed Dad every time he said your money was only being invested temporarily. When I finally saw documents with your name on them, I chose not to ask because I was afraid of the answer. Those words hurt, but they were honest. Melissa explained that Claire wasn't legally required to cooperate with us, but Claire made a choice anyway. She agreed to testify, not for revenge and not to protect herself, but because she finally understood that her silence had allowed the lies to continue for too long. For me, that was not just the end of my sister's old life, it was the beginning of the woman she was finally choosing to become.
2 days after Claire agreed to testify as a witness, she came to see me. When the doorbell rang, I assumed it was a delivery or Ethan coming home early from work, but when I opened the door, Claire was standing there. She wasn't wearing her usual designer clothes or her flawless camera-ready makeup. She just looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes from a lack of sleep. Surprised, I stepped aside to let her in. A heavy silence settled between us, thick and suffocating, much like the atmosphere in the legal deposition rooms. I turned toward the kitchen to make some tea, but Claire gently waved her hand. Instead of sitting on the sofa, she leaned against the windowsill, staring out at the small garden in my backyard. "I didn't come here to beg for your forgiveness, Hannah," Claire said. Her voice was quiet but steady. She turned to look at me, her eyes completely stripped of the pride that usually defined New England's top wedding designer. "I only came to tell you the truth, a truth I should have spoken years ago." I kept quiet, waiting. I kept telling myself Dad knew what he was doing, Claire whispered, her hands tight and trembling. She confessed that while managing the family business, she had occasionally seen my name on a few financial files and wire transfer documents. A shadow of suspicion had crossed her mind back then. I suspected something, but I didn't dare ask Dad. I chose to look away. She looked straight at me, tears finally brimming in her eyes. Growing up, I had never seen Claire cry, not even when a major bridal showcase fell through, and not under the heaviest pressures from our parents. She had always been the golden standard of poise and perfection. Claire reached up with a shaking hand, slowly slipped the diamond ring off her finger, and placed it quietly on the wooden table. She stared down at it, then back at me, her face completely shattered. Right now, I don't even know what parts of my life were really mine anymore. She didn't stay long. Having dropped the weight of the lie, Claire said goodbye and walked out. I stood by the window, watching her figure disappear past the trees at the end of the driveway. There was no reconciliation hug between us, no grand promises, and no more explosive resentment. As I closed the door,
I thought back to my grandmother's old cassette tape. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't begin with an apology. Sometimes it begins with someone finally telling the truth.
By the time our case reached its first formal hearing, I realized something surprising. I no longer cared about winning. Don't misunderstand me. I wanted justice, accountability, and the truth to exist somewhere outside my own memories. But I wasn't sitting in that courtroom hoping to destroy my parents. That had never been my goal. The hearing wasn't a dramatic television trial. There was no jury, no emotional closing arguments, and no surprise witnesses bursting through the doors. It was quieter than that, almost uncomfortable, because for the first time in years, everyone had to stop performing and start answering questions. The courtroom wasn't interested in our family image, it cared about facts. Melissa Grant, my probate attorney, sat beside me with binders filled with evidence. Across the room sat my parents. Walter Whitmore, my father, looked older than I remembered. The confidence that had carried him through decades of business presentations had completely disappeared. Beside him sat my mother, Diane Whitmore, staring down at her hands. For years I had imagined confronting them. I thought I would feel angry, satisfied, or vindicated. Instead, I mostly felt tired. The judge encouraged both parties to discuss whether a negotiated resolution was possible before the litigation continued. For the first time since everything began, my father spoke directly to me instead of speaking through lawyers. His voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. "Hannah," he stopped, looking at me for several long seconds before continuing. "I need you to understand something. I never hated you." The words hung in the room. Part of me wanted to reject them immediately, because people who love you aren't supposed to leave empty chairs at your wedding or steal your inheritance. And yet, looking at him, I believed he was telling the truth. Walter took a slow breath. I always believed Claire could save the business. She understood the clients, the industry, everything. I convinced myself that if the business survived, everyone would benefit. So every time we needed money, I told myself it was temporary, one small compromise at a time, until it became fraud. No one interrupted him. He wasn't trying to justify what he had done. He was explaining how he had slowly convinced himself that wrong decisions weren't really wrong if they served a larger purpose. The courtroom remained silent. Then my mother spoke. It was the first time I had heard her voice since Claire's wedding. She wasn't looking at the judge or the attorneys. She was looking at me, with tears filling her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm not sorry because we lost money or because people found out. I'm sorry because I spent so many years asking what the business needed, what Claire needed, what your father needed, and I never once stopped to ask, what did you need?" The room became completely still. That question reached a place inside me I didn't know still existed. Because she was right. My entire childhood had been built around adapting to everyone else's expectations. Be patient, be understanding, support your sister, and wait your turn. I had spent years believing that if I asked for less, eventually someone would choose me anyway. No one ever did. Not because I wasn't worthy, but because I had quietly accepted being invisible. The judge looked toward me. "Miss Whitmore, would you like to respond?" I hadn't planned a speech. Everything I wanted to say had lived inside me for decades. When I finally spoke, my voice was neither angry nor loud. It was simply honest. I spent 31 years trying to earn a place in this family. I thought if I worked harder, asked for less, and never complained, eventually I'd become enough. I slowly shook my head. I finally realized something. Love isn't something you should have to qualify for. No one cried immediately, no dramatic music played, and no one applauded. Real life rarely works that way.
But something changed in that room, not because the legal case had ended, but because for the first time, every person sitting there stopped arguing about money and started confronting what had been missing all along: love that was never supposed to come with conditions. As we left the courthouse that afternoon, I understood something my grandmother had tried to teach me years earlier. Families aren't defined by the sacrifice one person makes to keep everyone else comfortable. They're defined by whether every member is allowed to belong without having to earn the right.
People often ask me what happened after the hearing. They expect one dramatic ending, one final courtroom victory where justice erased years of pain. Real life doesn't work that way. Justice can hold people accountable, but it cannot give you back the years you lost. Several months later, the court issued its final rulings. My probate attorney, Melissa Grant, called me before the official documents arrived. The court found Walter Whitmore liable for multiple breaches of fiduciary duty, she said. He is ordered to provide financial restitution, and effective immediately, he is permanently removed as trustee. I closed my eyes, not because I was celebrating, but because for the first time since my grandmother passed away, the trust that was supposed to protect my future finally belonged to me. But the financial outcome wasn't the miracle many expected. Whitmore Estate couldn't survive what had happened. The company had been carrying more than $5 million in debt long before anyone discovered what my father had done. Once investors withdrew, lenders demanded repayment. Within months, the estate was sold. The gardens, the ballroom, the property that had defined our family for decades, it all belonged to someone else. By the time secured debts, taxes, and legal claims were satisfied, much of the trust money that had been misused simply no longer existed. I recovered part of my inheritance, not all of it. Surprisingly, that no longer felt like the greatest loss. Claire's life changed just as dramatically. She no longer appeared on magazine covers, and luxury wedding publications stopped calling. Instead, she made a different choice. About a year later, she opened a small design studio. No investors, no family business, no famous estate. Just Claire. One employee, a rented office, and clients she earned one relationship at a time. The business was modest, but for the first time in her life, every success belonged entirely to her. Just honest work. My mother, Diane, withdrew almost completely from public life. The interviews and charity galas ended. She no longer spent her days protecting an image that no longer existed. Occasionally, she would send me handwritten birthday cards, always short, never asking for forgiveness, simply hoping I was doing well. As for my father, Walter accepted the court's judgment. He chose not to appeal. Maybe he was tired, or maybe, after spending so many years trying to protect a legacy, he realized there wasn't much left to protect. People assumed I would use the recovered money to buy a larger house or retire early. Instead, I kept thinking about my grandmother, so I created something she would have loved: the Margaret Whitmore Archive Fellowship. Every year, it provides grants to young conservators dedicated to preserving historical documents that might otherwise be lost forever. Every time a fellowship recipient restores a piece of history, I feel as though my grandmother's kindness continues speaking through someone new. One afternoon, nearly 2 years later, I was back at the National Maritime Archive. On my work table lay a faded handwritten letter from a sailor who had crossed the Atlantic more than 100 years earlier. As I carefully repaired a small tear on the page, I found myself smiling, not because life had become perfect, but because it had finally become honest. For years, I thought healing meant repairing my relationship with my family. I understand now that healing meant repairing my relationship with myself. Those 2 empty chairs at my wedding used to represent rejection, proof that I had never been enough. Today, I see them differently.
Those chairs remind me of the moment I stopped waiting for someone else to choose me. For years, I believed inheritance meant money. My grandmother left me something far greater. She left me the courage to stop asking people to love me the way they never could. When I remember my wedding now, those two empty chairs are still empty in my memory, but they no longer symbolize what I lost. They remind me of what I found: myself.